Paul Anderson, a simple Tennessee resident, spent most of his early life working small jobs on farms and in his local town. Soon, the United States became involved in the Second World War, and Paul joined the U.S. Army, becoming a tank commander. From North Africa to Belgium, Paul and his crew fought in a Sherman tank. In Germany, they were upgraded to fighting in the new Pershing tank. Because of the crew's fighting ability, they were among few selected to be crews of the new T-29 heavy tank as part of the invasion of Japan. Although a hardened veteran, that young, innocent farm boy still lives inside Paul. The scene cuts to an American LST opening its giant front doors, and the first vehicle to drive out is a T-29 heavy tank with its commander, Sergeant Paul Anderson, sitting out the top hatch. The tank drives out and joins a large Marine force preparing to march on the city of Kagoshima. Because of the tank's heavy weight, it didn't take part in the initial invasion, but now it's ready to lead the American assault on the city. The attack begins, and the first major defense the Americans encounter is a roadblock with a number of Japanese soldiers firing on advancing Marines. After exchanges of gunfire from both sides, the Japanese defenders are killed and the T-29 advances forward. As the T-29 drives over the roadblock, it gets fired upon by a Japanese Hago light tank, but the shells just glance off of the lone beast's armor. Despite being loaded with a high-explosive round, rather than armor-piercing, the T-29's gunner aims at the Japanese tank, and when Paul yells, "Fire!" the T-29 fires its first round on Japanese soil. The high-explosive shell slams into the Hago, and the explosive force tears off the turret and sets the tank ablaze. With all immediate threats dealt with, Paul rises from the top hatch of his tank and orders the Marine force to continue pushing forward. Eventually, they fight to and through the courtyard featured in Part 1, where they meet up with Sergeant Davis. Once the city is clear of Japanese soldiers, Paul and a tank column receive orders to secure the left flank of the American objective for Kyushu. After a quick rest and resupply, the armored force heads out with Paul leading the column. Cut to an hour later, the tank column drives through thick forest and are suddenly ambushed by emplaced Japanese anti-tank guns. Because of the T-29's thick armor, anti-tank shells just bounce off, and the T-29 along with other tanks fire back at Japanese positions. The cannons are soon silenced, but then the American force faces another attack, this time from Japanese infantry. Paul sees them and grabs his Thompson to shoot at them from the top of his tank before they can reach the convoy. Escorting Marines gun down the charging Japanese troops, and Paul manages to shoot a Japanese soldier charging at his tank with a lunge mine. With the ambush defeated, the convoy advances to its objective and sets up defenses. The T-29 pulls into a position, but then the engine suddenly cuts out, and the tank breaks down, much to the frustration of Paul and his crew. Paul hops out and meets up with the other tank commanders to explain the situation. However, they pause when they hear something falling from the sky. Japanese artillery fire. Soldiers retreat back to their tanks while Marines try to take cover as shells begin detonating everywhere. Paul and his crew sit inside as artillery explodes all around their tank, and eventually, the bombardment stops. Paul rises from his hatch and looks to find almost the entire convoy decimated, with few Marines alive. Of the 5 tanks in the advance force, only the T-29 and a Pershing remain, while the rest are no more than burning piles of metal. Paul contacts the other Pershing commanded by Don, a friend of Paul ever since boot camp, and lets him know that he will contact the American command force and request reinforcements. Suddenly, they hear a new sound, what sounds like marching in the distance, and the two hide in their tanks, thinking the soldiers are Japanese. And they are right. Looking through viewports, they see Japanese soldiers march by, and then see more, and more. This massive force marches past the carnage, and the wounded Marines are quickly silenced with bayonets, after which the Japanese move along. Once they are gone, Paul immediately gets on the radio to warn the Marines of incoming Japanese soldiers, but all he hears on the radios is chaos. The scene cuts to a massive swarm of Japanese soldiers charging at American forces all around Kyushu. This massive counterattack has been in preparation before the Americans even arrived on the island. Their goal is to push the Americans back to the sea, similar to the counterattacks on Saipan and Hacksaw Ridge. Thousands of Japanese soldiers are taking part in this attack, and it seems to be working. American forces are being pushed back from their positions. The Americans withdraw further back to other positions while continuously firing at the advancing Japanese. Paul and his crew see the carnage unfolding and realize they need to inform the Navy and Air Force to send in everything to fight the Japanese attack. Paul manages to get in contact with naval forces and informs them of the current situation. Naval commanders inform him that squadrons of Sky Raiders and Corsairs are on their way, and American forces on the beaches have been warned of the Japanese counterattack. On the beach, large formations of T-92 howitzer motor carriages and other heavy artillery pieces receive coordinates of Japanese positions and prepare to fire. Battleships aim their massive cannons, and air squadrons fly to the island packed with cannons, bombs, and even chemical agents. Marines take up positions and wait for the upcoming bombardment, and when Japanese forces arrive, the barrage begins. Battleships fire guns of all calibers at the island. Artillery pieces on the beach unleash their cannons as planes enter the carnage. Explosions go off all over Kyushu, with every shell and bullet cutting down Japanese troops. Something to keep in mind is that although this Japanese counterattack has been successful in pushing back the Americans, they began losing soldiers the literal second the attack began. This unrelenting bombardment causes Japanese casualties to skyrocket as countless numbers of Imperial troops perish. American Marines holding positions across Kyushu fire upon the continually advancing Japanese, and although their overwhelming forces keep attacking, the Americans manage to hold their ground and no longer retreat. This is good news, as they are now only within a few miles of the beaches and cannot afford to be pushed back any further. At one point, many Japanese soldiers completely stop after seeing the attack failing and try to turn back, but are forced to keep advancing by their commanders. After hours of constant gunfire and bombings, the Japanese counterattack has been decimated, and the Americans successfully hold the line. Any remaining Japanese troops are ordered to pull back and be evacuated in preparation for a future defense of Tokyo, and the Americans retake their positions. Back with Paul, he and his crew work hard to repair their engine when a large convoy of Marines, led by Sergeant Davis, pass by them. Davis stops to speak with Paul and gives him thanks for saving his life in Kagoshima, after which he and his Marines continue marching. December 21st, 1945. The invasion of Kyushu has been a success for the United States, with the planned section of the island to be captured being placed under American occupation. With airfields on the island secured, the Americans can use them to launch constant bombing missions against Japanese cities. By the end of Operation Olympic, American casualties are in the tens of thousands, while Japanese casualties are easily 3 times that. But they are only going to get higher as this war drags on. Cut to a few days later, Paul and his crew watch an airfield as squadrons of B-29s prepare their engines as they are about to embark on a bombing mission. The crew watch the squadron take off, and Paul gives them a salute as they fly off to the horizon.